Hello and welcome to Analysis. The comparison of Israel's occupation of Palestine to the apartheid regime in South Africa has long been controversial. Apartheid in South Africa ended in 1994, but Israeli apartheid, a system of ethnic and religious segregation, prevails. Today marks the beginning of Israeli Apartheid Week, an international initiative that seeks to support the growing boycott, disinvestment and sanctions campaign. The campaign is modelled on Boycott Apartheid. That was the campaign that was part of the struggle against the racist regime in South Africa. But just how similar are the two systems? And to what extent might the current campaign brand Israel as a discriminatory system of apartheid? Joining me in the studio is John Hillary from War on Want, Baroness Jenny Tong, and Ben White, who's the author of a book called Israeli Apartheid, A Beginner's Guide. On the line, we have Mustafa Barghouti, General Secretary of the Palestine National Initiative. Welcome to the programme, everybody. Ben, let's begin with you, seeing the book's A Beginner's Guide. Why should we call the system in Palestine apartheid?
I think one of the important things to remember is that when we talk about Israeli apartheid, although there is an interesting comparison to be made with the regime that existed in South Africa, nobody is saying that what exists today in Palestine is exactly the same. That's because a definition of apartheid developed under international law and in international treaties that can be taken and applied to a particular situation. And the key thing to remember is that you're looking at a series of inhumane acts that are not aberrations or excesses, but are committed as part of a system and are committed as part of institutionalized racism. And the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, in their country report on Israel in 2012, for the first time since the apartheid South African regime, reminded a state party, reminded Israel of the prohibition of apartheid.
So, John, are you happy with that? Do you think it works in a campaigning sense? I mean, I remember when the term first began to be used, I think even among supporters of the Palestinian cause, there was a kind of moment where, whoa, does that really work?
I think it really does work, and exactly as Ben says, the key thing here is the systematic aggression against a particular people by another. So it's where you have settler-only roads, which only Israeli settlers can use and Palestinians can't use. You have pass laws, just like as you had in South Africa in the past, where people cannot get from one place to another because the apartheid wall is in their way or because they're not being let through the checkpoints. That systematic, that institutionalized aggression, racism, is what makes it apartheid. And I think it's important in campaigning terms because it gives people a sense not just of what they can do through the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign, but also that there is a possibility of coming out of it at the other end. We defeated apartheid in South Africa. An international movement defeated apartheid there. We can do the same thing in Palestine.
Jenny, so what do you think? Do you think that perhaps one of the things that's made it a kind of proposition that people are willing to entertain is the existence of that apartheid wall? Because even in South Africa there was legal separation, but there wasn't actually a physical barrier.
Well, I think the wall it's a tremendous visual impact, you know, that people hold in their minds. But I think it's also people like Archbishop Tutu, you know, said it's like apartheid, only worse. For goodness sake. And he should know. I mean, he was there all through those years. Jimmy Carter said likewise. He's written a book about it. And the other thing that convinces me it's right to do it, and it's right to link it to the boycott campaign in the way we did South Africa, which was successful, is that the Israelis protest about it so much. And you can always be sure that you've touched on a nerve with the Israelis because they start rubbishing things and they start trying to make fun of it and say, oh, no, it's not important, and no, it isn't. And I think that is the most telling thing. The Israelis now protest too much. So we know we've hit the nail on the head.
Mustafa Barghouti, you've been at the core of the BDS campaign. Do you think over the time that it's existed that this definition, this way of looking at the Israeli system has got a wider acceptance? Hello, Mustafa.
Yes.
Do you think that this definition of the Israeli system as an apartheid system has gained a wider acceptance over the period that you've been involved with the BDS campaign?
Excuse me, I didn't get the full question. Can you repeat that?
Okay, I'm sorry, one more time. Do you think the term Israeli apartheid is now more widely accepted than it was when the BDS campaign began?
Absolutely. There is no doubt about that. And the very good proof of that is what's happening today, with this year's week against Israeli apartheid is so wide and so big and in an unprecedented manner in more than 200 universities and institutions worldwide. I think the term is now used even by some Israeli politicians, including people like Ehud Olmert or Tzipi Livni. It's true that they say Israel will become an apartheid, but of course it is already an apartheid. But I think the term, since we started talking about it more than 10 years ago, it is now much more widely used and much more acceptable, and that is exactly what worries the Israeli side.
Ben, what do you think in terms of the comparison with not just the way in which the system operates vis-à-vis the Palestinians, but about the Palestinians' capability to resist? Because often a parallel is drawn with the movement in South Africa, but the analogy kind of runs out a bit there, doesn't it?
Yep. I mean, one of the differences between the South African apartheid regime and Israeli policies towards the Palestinians is the way in which black labour in South Africa was needed by the white minority regime, and thus was also a tool that could be used by black South Africans as resistance. Whereas in the case of Palestine, the Zionist project actually never required or even desired a captive Palestinian labour force. It actually prefers to simply remove the indigenous population altogether. Now, obviously, that hasn't been done in its entirety, but there isn't that same dynamic there, which is an important difference. And I think that probably informed and informs the way in which Palestinians are keen to have that international solidarity because of the fact that they know that given the sort of deck of cards available to them, given the support that Israel has enjoyed to date internationally, it's going to require that impetus and that push outside, as well as their ongoing steadfastness and own resistance efforts to really decolonise the country.
I mean, that's such an important difference, Ben. Loads of people say to me, you know, when I have said in the past that I've understood where suicide bombers were coming from, you know, why young people and why people felt they had to do this. And they say, oh, and the rockets going from Gaza, you know, by the jihadists. They say, why can't they protest peacefully? And you say, sorry, come on, how can you protest peacefully? They can't withdraw their labour because they have none. They can't boycott goods within Palestine because if they don't eat, they have to get things from Israel to actually eat. I mean, there is no way that the Palestinians can actually protest peacefully. If they gather in large crowds, they get rubber bullets fired at them and people get badly injured. But they do that in great numbers. And recently, actually, it's been happening a lot. We've heard very little about it on the media, but there's been demonstrations all over the place. So I think this is a very important point. The blacks did have that weapon. They could actually withdraw their labour and go on strike, but the Palestinians have no such recourse.
John, do you think it's the point that Ben made there about the weight that kind of rests on the boycott strategy is greater even than the South African case because of the internal weaknesses of the Palestinian resistance or their strategic place in the society?
I think it's absolutely crucial that we maintain the highest level of activity around the world to put pressure on our own governments to break with the Israeli regime. And I think that's the other side of it, the level of support which comes for the Israeli regime, despite all of the words about them not being genuine partners for peace. We still continue through the British government, through the European Union, and through so many other governments around the world to give Israel carte blanche. It's allowed to do whatever it likes, absolutely whatever it likes. And that means that we, the people, grassroots movements, activist groups across the world, have got to take up that responsibility because we know that our elected representatives aren't going to do it. That's why, again, the real importance of BDS, the boycott bit particularly, it gives people the opportunity to get involved. Because we can't call sanctions ourselves on arms trade, but we can get involved on boycott as well as calling for others to block the arms trade.
I think particularly in Israel's case, we must get academics involved. You know, we must get the universities more involved in the boycott campaign, and musicians, and sport, for goodness sake. I was talking earlier about the two footballers who were shot in the legs and beaten up, only their legs. Two boys coming back from football practice a few weeks ago in Abu Dhabi. And there should be, and there is building, a huge protest about that one incident where the IDF have ruined the chances of two young boys of ever playing football again, just out of sheer spite, no other reason at all. Why should a country that allows that to happen be admitted to the World Cup? Why should they not be thrown out?
Mustafa Barghouti, sometimes when you hear pro-Israel commentators describing the use of this term as racist in itself, what's your answer to that criticism?
The use of what?
Sometimes you hear pro-Israeli commentators saying that the very use of the term apartheid is in itself a racist term. What's your answer to those critics?
Well, of course, no Israeli or supporter of Israel would be happy about using the term apartheid. It's actually a very shameful thing to have an apartheid system in the 21st century. And they do understand that. But we always challenge them and ask them to give us an alternative description of a situation where, on average, a Palestinian citizen is allowed to use 50 meters of water, 50 cubic meters of water per year, while an illegal Israeli settler can use 2,000.
OK, Mustafa, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to stop you there because the line is very bad. But we'll try and return to you when we can get a better link. John, you must have heard that criticism as well, that this in itself is the Jewish Chronicle was running a story only the other day saying that to use this term is a racist term. What do you say to that kind of criticism?
Yeah, I think that's nonsense because, as Ben pointed out earlier, there are specific criteria which allow for a particular situation to be described as apartheid. So it's not something which is being thrown out as a slur. It's a very precise and definite legal term which is being applied to a situation which conforms exactly to the criteria which have been set for it. I think for people who are saying that they consider it to be some form of attack on them personally, they need to look at their own position over and against this situation. So if they're particularly from the Jewish community here, they can join the groups like the Jews for Justice for Palestinians, the Jewish Socialist Group, who work very much as part of the movement to support BDS and also to support calling Israel an apartheid state. It's a choice for Jews, just as it is for everybody else. It's a choice you make on political grounds. Do you want to support the oppressor or do you want to support the oppressed? And that's quite an easy choice.
Ben, do you want to take us a little bit more through that? Because it's quite an important argument to say that actually it isn't just a kind of random term of political designation even, never mind about abuse. It's actually referred to a technical definition. Do you want to talk us through where that came from and what precisely it meant and how it was established?
I mean, you can trace its roots back to the time of apartheid South Africa, when you had a UN convention that was criminalising effectively apartheid from the international position, and then that comes through all the way through to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in the 1990s, which is an important sort of location to find apartheid outlawed. I think actually that one of the biggest sources of anxiety from Israel's point of view about the use of the term apartheid is the way in which it moves criticism of their policies away from the security paradigm, the so-called security paradigm, which Israel is much more comfortable defending policies within, even if some policies are criticised. If it's within the paradigm of security, that's one thing. But it moves it from that paradigm to a paradigm of systematic racial discrimination, which is, of course, a completely different sort of framework to be looking at Israeli policies. And I think that's one of the reasons why they're particularly upset about that kind of term and about that kind of analysis.
It delegitimises Israel. It delegitimises Israel as the sort of modern democratic state which they try and sell themselves as being.
I mean, Jenny, you're sort of moving in parliamentary circles more than most of us. How far do you think that this kind of argument has now got among the kind of governmental classes? I mean, it might be quite widely accepted. Do you think it's making any impact in the sort of hall in the corridors of Whitehall?
It's making impact privately. And there's certainly more MPs in the Commons and more peers in the House of Lords who know about Palestine and support Palestine and stand up and speak up for Palestine. So things are moving and things are different. I suspect the personal feelings and views of our ministers are quite different from their actual actions towards Israel. And you have to ask why this is. I mean, is it just the power of the United States of America? No, sorry, it isn't. It's to do with commerce, it's to do with trade, it's to do with influence. You know, Israel, the pro-Israel lobby has a lot of influence over our governments, both here and in America. I mean, it's quite obvious in America, in the recent events in America, how delighted people have been to see AIPAC, you know, the American-Israel Political Committee, actually defeated on Iran and defeated on Syria. That was really, really good news that that happened, even though it came from Obama, you know, everyone was writing him off. He actually stood up to them and he won against them. And I think that's one of the most hopeful things that's happened recently, because what has always made me despair is that whatever a minister will tell you privately, they will never act on it publicly with Israel. And that's because of the strength of the lobby, and that's what we have to deal with.
OK, well, we'll be returning to some of those issues that Jenny Tong's just raised there in the second half of the programme. That's it for the first half, but do rejoin us after the break, because we'll be looking in more detail at the BDS campaign and Israeli apartheid after the break.